May what I say and what you hear be in the name of God. Amen. So we're starting a sermon series that will start today and continue for the next 3 weeks. Not Palm Sunday. We'll go right up to 5 Lent. And let me just say that the impetus for this came from watching a YouTube video by Bishop Robert Barron, who was giving a lecture to Christian educators about being prepared to answer questions from youth about the existence of God. And I thought that was amazing. And I thought to myself, wow, I've been here long enough now that, kids who were 10 when I arrived are 21 now. And I've watched as some of them, you know how they are when they're young and they're just little sponges and they're just so excited about everything and they're interested in God. And then in the teenage years, and we've all gone through it. We're hardwired into this period of rebellion that's part of our nature. And it's sort of right at that point where, whether it's teachers in school or friends or social media or all of the above, kids are bombarded with arguments against God. And even woe be to an adult who were to post something on social media about his or her faith. As a matter of fact, I actually know someone who came into faith as an adult, and shortly after their baptism, posted on Facebook something about their faith in God, and they were blasted, absolutely blasted by their friends, because if you think about it, they had all these friends on social media from before this time when this person was baptized and became a Christian, and wanting to share the faith ends up getting lambasted for it. So the social media is particularly hostile to religion and to Christianity in particular. And, you think about it, even when I was a teenager, what was my level of education when I was a teen? I knew some Bible stories, I knew something about sin and forgiveness, and I knew, at least I had some idea why Jesus died on the cross. And growing up in a liturgical church, I knew which candle to light first, that kind of stuff. And all of that's fine, all of that is good, but all of it is based on a prior assumption, right? That there is a God. That, in the church, we don't tend to deal with the questions about, is there a God? We deal with questions like, who is God, right? Which already assumes that God exists. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think that, the whole enterprise of church is based on that assumption that there is a God, and so maybe, and even entertaining the idea that there might not be a God is somehow blasphemous. And then in terms of, when could it happen, people like me, we're trained to preach on the lessons, and in particular the gospel. I can still remember from seminary being told, preach the gospel, preach on the gospel appointed for the day, And I at least had the presence of mind to say to myself, well, if the Lord tells me to preach on the Old Testament, that's what I'm going to do. But still, I'm preaching on the lessons that are appointed for today. And there are no lessons appointed on a Sunday that deal with, is there a God? Okay? I'm trying to think where in the scriptures you might find such a thing. Maybe it's Ecclesiastes. But, those, to the extent there might be that kind of question in the Bible, we're not going to read it on Sunday. And so if I treat as a law that you must preach on the lessons, then this conversation would never happen. So I'm going to change that. I have parents in mind. I think all of us would benefit from being prepared, at least in our own mind, not so much for arguing with other people. That's not really what this is about. But when you're confronted with these ideas about or reasons why God doesn't exist, maybe you'll be a little bit prepared to think about it yourself and think about it clearly. And if there was one book that I would recommend, and especially if you're a parent, I beg you to go get this book and read it. It's The Reason for God, which is the name of this series by Tim Keller. It's a very accessible book. I'm not going to say that it's necessarily easy to read, but it's not an academic book, and yet it's got all kinds of footnotes. So if you wanted to dig deeper, everything that you would need to do more research is all right there. Tim Keller, The Reason for God. So we're going to do this sermon series, like I said, based on the name of that book, and this sermon is called The Echo of a Voice, The Origins of Justice, and the Injustice of the Religious, particularly Christian. And Carolyn next week is going to talk about suffering and the love of God. Then I'm going to talk about some of the classic clues for God that Christian thinkers have come up over the ages. And then our last sermon, it's either going to be dealing with the question about, what about other religions? How can Christians say that, their religion is the only religion or the right religion? Or I'm going to talk about science. Doesn't science disprove God? And so I'm kind of wrestling around in my head with which way to go. If you have a preference about that, by the way, zip me a note, okay? That might sway me one way or the other. All right, so the origins of justice. Theologians and philosophers, for that matter, when they ask about, is there a God, one of the questions that comes up is, why is it that humans seem to have an innate sense of justice, a desire for justice? There's this innate sense that some things are right and some things are wrong. And it is innate. And if you have any doubt about that, you just listen to kids at a playground. Sooner or later, you're going to hear them say, "That's not fair." Even if their understanding of fairness is a bit skewed and pointed at themselves, they have this sense that there is right and wrong. It's hardwired into us. It's as though there is in each of us, as N.T. Wright puts it in Simply Christian, an echo of a voice. As he writes, speaking with calm, healing authority, speaking about justice, about righting what is wrong in ourselves and in our world. Now, right away, moral relativism would want to come back at this and say, well, to the extent that we have a sense of right and wrong, it's really not real. That our sense of right and wrong is based on culture, sociology, all kinds of other things. And the bottom line with relativism, moral relativism, is no one has the right to impose their morality on anybody else. Or to put it another way, everyone has the right to find truth inside him or herself. And Tim Keller brings this up, and I agree with this. But isn't it the case, though, that there are some things that go on in the world that you would say that's wrong, regardless of where they come from, regardless of whether they think what they're doing is right? Most people would look at it and say, no, that is wrong. I mean, why is it that it really is kind of hard to find, in practice, a consistent moral relativist? And I think it might be because there is in all of us this, not just a sense of moral values, but a sense of moral obligation, of a desire to do right with other people. I mean, if moral relativism is correct, well, then if Putin wants to invade the Ukraine, how can we say that there's anything wrong with that? Okay? And I don't know if any moral relativist would say that that's okay. So they kind of defeat their own argument. Now, N.T. Wright, when he uses the phrase echo of a voice, I think he's referring to this sense of moral obligation that's in us. There's this sense of, it's not just that there are things that are right and wrong, but we ought to be doing things that are right And we ought to be doing things that are overcoming the wrong. And there are basically three ways to respond to this claim that there is a voice. One is to say, as moral relativists might say, but also I think evolutionary psychologists as well would say that it's just a fantasy. It's not real. We just have to get used to the world the way it is. And down that road we'll find Machiavelli, Nietzsche, among others, the world of naked power and grabbing what you can get, and the only sin is to be caught. Or we could say that the voice is more like a dream of a different world altogether. A world where we really belong, where everything is just. It's a world we can escape to in our dreams and hopefully escape to one day for good. But that world has nothing to do with this one, except that people in this world find themselves at times dreaming about that one. And that approach really doesn't change anything. All it does is console us with the thought that sometime, somewhere, things will get better, even if we can't do anything about it here and now. Or we can say that the reason we hear this echo of a voice is that there's someone speaking, whispering to us, someone who cares very much about this present world and our present selves, someone who has made us in the world for a purpose that includes justice. Now, I said that, evolutionary psychology also would sort of take option one. It's just a dream. It's not real. So evolutionary psychology would come back and say, well, everything about us is the product of evolution. And so to the extent that we have a sense of right and wrong, that is because people who acted that way tended to survive and in greater numbers, and so they would pass on those genes. And, the initial comeback to that would be, I think, well, what about the evolutionary process of the strong over the weak? What about the evolutionary process of protecting one's own and attacking people who are different from us? How can we say that that is wrong? We kind of end up in the same place as moral relativism. If our sense of right and wrong is nothing more than the product of evolution, then how can we say that there's anything unjust about the world? How can we say that? Because after all, evolution is violent, right? And it depends on the strong dominating the weak. So evolution, and I'm not saying I'm against evolution. I'm not saying that at all. Just to be clear. I believe in evolution, but I don't think evolution can explain everything. And I don't think it explains this sense that we have of right and wrong, a desire for justice. It ends up not being able to explain where that comes from. Now, people love to point out the differences in the world religions and say that, well, if there's an echo of a voice, that a voice sure does say a lot of different things because no one seems to be able to agree on anything. I would say, well, yeah, it kind of looks that way, at least in terms of justice and in terms of this particular topic. The three great religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all in agreement that there is a voice calling out for justice. Judaism speaks of a God who made the world and built into it a passion for justice because it was God's own passion. And Christianity speaks of the same God having brought the passion into play in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And then Islam, drawing on some Jewish and Christian stories and ideas, creates a new synthesis in which the revelation of God's will in the Quran is the voice that we are hearing, and it is the ideal which would put the world to rights if only it were obeyed. So there are a lot of differences between those three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But on the question of justice, we all are in agreement. The reason why we think we hear a voice is because we are. And as Christians, we believe that Jesus, that in Jesus, the voice that we thought we heard became flesh and lived and died as one of us. In Jesus, we see the embodiment of God's passion for justice, and we believe that what Jesus did and what happened to him set in motion God's plan for the rescue and renewal of the world and putting it back to rights. And therefore, Christians believe it's incumbent upon us, if we claim to follow Jesus, to bring God's justice to bear in the world. We are, as we read in Philippians this morning, we are citizens of heaven. And if you were with us last Wednesday, you heard Bishop Matt Gunter talking about the relationship between baptism and communion. And at one point he talked about baptism as being this moment when we transfer allegiance. We transfer our allegiance from the world to God, and then we begin to live as citizens of this new kingdom, which means that we are bringing God's justice and righteousness to bear in the world. Which brings me to the second part of the sermon. Well, I can hear people thinking, Jesus' followers haven't made much progress, have they? All right, let's be honest. What about the Crusades? What about the Spanish Inquisition? Isn't it the case that Christians are responsible for most of the injustices that we see in the world? And indeed, I've heard atheists argue this point, that most of the, if not all of the injustices we see in the world can be brought back to religion, and especially Christianity. And if we could just eradicate a religion, the world would be just and peaceful. Now, I want to invite you to consider the logic of that kind of thinking. And the first thing to say is, have Christians behaved badly throughout history, and do they behave badly today? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. We can't deny that. But can't we also say that there have been an awful lot of people who, inspired by the Enlightenment and modernity, have done awful, terrible things? And the answer to that is yes. We could go back to the French Revolution, right? Perhaps the birthplace of the Enlightenment. And there, in the name of equality and justice and reason, thousands of people were put to death. Or move into the 20th century, the worst century on record. Some 50 million people slaughtered in 100 years. And who were the murderers? The religious? No. It was the Pol Pots, the Mao Zedongs, the Joseph Stalins, the Adolf Hitlers, the people who were anti-religious. And if we were to say, on the basis of those bad actors, that the Enlightenment and modernity are a waste of time, we would be unjustified. Okay, we would. Let me put it in a little lighter light, okay? There's this bicycle race every July in France called the Tour de France. And, I started taking up cycling seriously in 2003, not long after Lance Armstrong, really got into it and, winning year after year after year, 7 years in a row, winning the Tour de France. And during that period of time, several cyclists were caught. They tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs and were banned. Others were accusing Lance Armstrong, but somehow he managed to, the tests that he was given, he managed to squeak out of them, and nothing ever was conclusive until finally it all came crashing down on him. And we discover that during this whole time, there's been cheating and lying among a lot of people, a lot of cyclists. So should we say, on the basis of these bad actors, that we should do away with the Tour de France? Oh, no one has said that. But that's the thinking, you see. That's the same kind of thinking. That on the basis of people who act badly, we need to do away with Christianity. No, that doesn't make any sense. When it comes to the Tour de France, what do people say? Well, we need to deal with these bad actors. Or we need to look at what is it about the Tour de France that sets people up to want to cheat Maybe they feel they have to cheat. Why do they feel that way? Is there something we can do differently? We need to fix it, in other words, okay? And that's really the answer to the problem of Christians claiming, or Christians acting badly. Christians claim that the echo of a voice that's crying out for justice in the world is the voice of God. And this God is fully revealed in Jesus of Nazareth, who took upon himself all of the violence, all of the hatred, dysfunction, intolerance, stupidity, and injustice of the world. And he responds not in violence, but with forgiveness. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And so, therefore, we know that when Christians behave in unjust, stupid, and vile ways, that they have stepped away and stepped out of the tradition of Christianity. And Christian bad behavior, which is undeniably there, should be judged on or in light of the God revealed in Jesus. It reminds me of last little story, and we're going to end. The last story I'll tell you, I was a deputy to General Convention in 2006 and 2009. And in 2006 in Anaheim, California, I remember leaving one of the sessions of the House of Deputies, and I walked out of the building we were in, and I must have walked out of the wrong exit. And I ended up smack dab in the middle of all these Christian protesters shouting just vitriol at gays and lesbians, and the signs that they were holding were just so vitriolic. And I was ashamed. I thought, I am so ashamed that these people are out here and claiming to do this in the name of Jesus, and they're wrong. They are just wrong. St. Augustine, that great theologian, put all this a bit differently. He maintained that in the heart is this empty space that nothing material can fill, not money, not sex, not power, not possessions. Our hearts, Augustine said, are restless till they rest in thee. So call it an echo of a voice. You can call it a God-shaped void in the human heart. There is a reason why we have these deep longings for justice. And for that matter, beauty. We could talk this way about beauty, and where does our sense of beauty come from, and our desire for beauty? Why are we drawn to beauty? There's a reason why we respond with righteous anger at what's going on in Ukraine. We respond the way we do to the indiscriminate killing of civilians. It's because of this echo of a voice. That's the reason, you see. The reason is God. Amen.